Good morning, Metalheads Unit. Welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown. And today we're looking at the sophomore album from Abbath entitled Outstrider. Because nothing says fun in the sun quite like Norwegian black metal. Cheers. I've made it very clear over the years that I'm not a huge fan of traditional black metal, old school black metal, Norwegian black metal, whatever the fuck you want to call it. I'm not a huge fan. I think it's repetitive. I think it's garish. I don't care much for the politics that inspired so many of these bands and musicians. And I don't care much for these politics still being, frankly, a vital part of this sound and genre. And there's just more interesting black metal out there, particularly within these last 5 or 6 years. Bands like Panopticon, bands like Death Heaven, bands like Zealand Ardor, Miraker, Ghostbath, taking the genre and twisting it inside out and doing all kinds of new and interesting things with it. I mean, for fuck's sakes, none of the bands I just mentioned sound even a little bit alike because of the last 5 or 6 years of development that black metal has seen. Why do I bring this up? Well, 2 reasons. One, someone somehow always forgets, even though I make it blatantly clear every time I have to talk about this fucking genre. And B, to illustrate that I already have a bit of a bias towards this genre, and in turn a bit of a bias towards Abbath, who has performed within this sound, this genre, for his entire career, most recently with this solo output, but most famously with the Norwegian band Immortal. However, of all of the figures to come out of the black metal movement, I've probably followed Abbath the most, not so much because of the music, but because of the character. He is an incredibly engaging frontman. He's arguably one of the few musicians from this genre, from this era of heavy metal, that seems fully aware of how inherently silly black metal is. Like, he's even gone on record to say that he wants to bring this genre of black metal back to the more rebellious, carefree, ridiculous stylings of Venom. That he doesn't think that it should always be super crazy in-your-face serious, that it doesn't always need to be Euronymous and Varg Vikernes crying about how ultra and true and real they are. They can just have fun. They can just be cool and stuff. And for that reason, I've enjoyed Abbath as a frontman and as a character. And in the years since leaving Immortal, he has arguably come true, 100% unabashed Abbath. His live shows are every bit as charismatic and dynamic and powerful as they were before. Abbath sounds way more confident on all of his new music. And this sophomore album is a perfect example of that. Abbath just lets loose, man. He plays the kind of music he wants to play. He's not interested in the hyper serious variants of black metal. He's more interested in having fun. He has no problem throwing in some really cool melodic leads. He has no problem throwing in mid-pace sections. He has no problem still indulging in some of the cliches, playing around with really icy atmospheres and really weird vocal effects. And the end result, in my opinion, is one of the more fun and interesting takes on traditional Norwegian black metal, and a record that I imagine for some could very well end up on their top 10. Not necessarily mine, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's talk about the good. Like I said, Abbath is in full control here. He's all over the place. He's having so much fun. He's confident. He's powerful. He's trying a lot of new things, but still playing with enough familiar blueprints and enough familiar ideas that it doesn't feel too out there, too crazy. Like, think of an Abbath album as a really good meal. Really all he's done this time around is he's played around with some of the spices to make it a little different, to give it a little color, a little extra garnish, that general idea. Take, for instance, title track Outstrider, a surprisingly really dramatic and cathartic song relying heavily on these really great chunky, mid-pace, blackened grooves, some ripping melodic solos, and some disgusting vocals from Abbath. He sounds like a fucking troll wandering through a blizzard, just cackled and mean and cold. Or opening track Common Ire of Hurricane, which notably pulls from the more melodic aspects of modern Behemoth. Or the following and appropriately titled track, Bridge of Spasms, which builds and builds and builds on top of these super fast, frantic tremolo riffs, with battering permafrost-covered drums and some weird vocal parts from Abbath that sounds like he's drawing from almost Gregorian chants. It's ominous and powerful and genuinely haunting, and it builds pretty much up until the middle of the track where it just starts to unleash on more ripping leads and some more mid-paced blackened heavy metal riffs. I also like the more modern and blatant black metal paint job given to Pace Till Death, a classic Bathory song. In some ways, this album reminds me a lot of Surgical Steel from Carcass. That album had a lot of underlying heavy metal influence that made the record feel grounded and accessible, even in its most extreme moments. This record is very similar. It's not quite as obvious in some parts when you have all this wild black metal instrumentation on top of everything, but it is noted. These subtle rock and roll flavors genuinely make a good difference. The band themselves perform really well too. I mean, the musicianship is a lot tighter, it's a lot more inspired on this record than it was before. I think it does a great job of being a great all-around record for all types of metalheads too. This would be a great introductory album for people who don't know a lot about black metal because it's more technically proficient and colorful and has a little bit more to offer than your average Mayhem or Darkthrone record. But at the same time, it still hits enough of those classic notes that I don't really see any fan of this original genre being that upset. Abbath has not forgotten that this is still black metal, and there are some things that are still required of black metal, and he does use those things and take some of them to interesting new levels. Well, at least by the standards of, like, this brand of traditional Norwegian black metal, I should say. Now, that being said, the blueprint, the skeleton of this record, is still pretty much in line with what we heard on Abbath's debut solo album. So that being said, if you were not super turned on by that record, I don't know if these extra influences and all these really charismatic performances would do enough to bring you back in. But that being said, Abbath is kind of like the poster boy for black metal at least this brand of black metal. So there's a good chance that you already know what you're getting into, so I don't picture that being a gigantic problem. I'm going to give this thing a 3.5 out of 5. I personally really enjoyed this record. I actually enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I was going to enjoy it. I was not really looking forward to reviewing this record at all, but color me impressed. It's dynamic and engaging and well written and extremely well performed. It does still fall into some of the pitfalls of traditional Norwegian black metal, but Abbath brings enough new life into these sounds and ideas that it's pretty easily forgotten. It's pretty easy to walk over those pitfalls and just go, whatever. And like I said before, it's a great all-around record for all kinds of metalheads. There's no doubt in my mind that the legions of traditional black metal fans are going to eat this fucking thing up, despite its more colorful and lavish influences and ideas. But because of those ideas, and also Abbath's natural charisma, it's also a really good record to show to people who don't know a lot about black metal. I've heard some people saying that this record is perhaps too similar to the first record and that the first record is better, and I really disagree. This album's probably going to stick with me a little bit longer than that first album, and I would say just within the realms of traditional black metal, like the traditional black metal sound, this is probably the most fun I've had listening to this genre in quite some time. It's by no means a perfect record, and it probably wouldn't change your mind if you straight up hate this genre, but it is an extremely exciting, solid, and even surprising record. 3.5 out of 5. It's pretty damn good. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately, and you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.